Welcome to another session this week. In this session, we are going to talk about the spinal cord. First, let's start about what is its main function. So, its main function of the spinal cord is the transmission of neuronal signal between the brain and the rest of the body in order for the body to communicate with the brain and share the response and send a specific signal. It does that through something called reflex action. But the reflex action can be divided into two different types. We have the somatic reflex arc and autonomic reflex arc. The somatic is mainly involved or primarily involved in muscles, such as skeletal muscles, for example, while the autonomic affect internal organs and nearby organs such as glands and smooth or cardiac muscles. The somatic reflex arc involves three major players. The three neurons that we have mentioned earlier in the course: sensory, relay, and motor neuron. First, let's start about explaining what is a reflex arc. So, what is a reflex action? A reflex action is mainly a response to a specific stimulus. So, for example, you've touched a hot surface or a hot pan without knowing. You instantly move your hand away. So, how does you move your hand away instantly? That's a reflex action. So in order for a reflex action to take place, it will pass through a reflex arc. So a reflex arc involves a stimulus, in which is, for example, here's a hot object in the example that we have mentioned. Second, the reflex arc involves sensors. We need sensors that sense this stimulus, the hot object. So sensors in the skin, for example, skin receptors, pressure receptors, pain receptors. Pressure receptors involves panicin corpuscles. So these receptors are the sensors that respond to the stimulus and generate an electrical impulse that will travel to the spinal cord. I've mentioned that the spinal cord is the major player in reflex actions, not the brain. So the brain may inhibit or stimulate some action, some reflex arcs, but the one who is responsible for all major reflex arcs is the spinal cord. So back again to the somatic reflex arc. So the stimulus, the hot object, stimulates the sensory receptors in the skin, for example, to fire up an impulse, a nerve impulse that will pass to the spinal cord. So how it will enter the spinal cord? It will enter through something called the dorsal root. It's afferent pathway. Afferent means towards to, and dorsal implies the same meaning, towards to the spinal cord, where it will interact or synapse with the relay neuron found inside the gray matter of the spinal cord. Once it synapses with the relay neuron in the gray matter of the spinal cord, the relay, which is the bridge between the sensory neurons and the motor neuron, will synapse with the motor neuron. The motor neuron will then generate the impulse or transmit the impulse to the effector. The effector is the muscle, and in this case we're talking about the somatic, so it's the skeletal muscle in your finger that will tell you to pull your finger away before you get burned. So this is simply how the somatic reflex arc works. So the major players are the stimulus, sensory neurons, relay neurons, motor neurons, and the effector muscle, and of course the spinal cord, where all the story happens. And as it's shown here, this is a complete picture of the somatic reflex arc with labels such as the dorsal root and the effector muscle and the stimulus and so on and so forth. Now let's move to the second type of the reflex arc, which is the autonomic reflex arc. So the main difference between the autonomic and the somatic reflex arc is the output, the motor output. For the autonomic, we have outputs such as internal organs, nearby organs, as I've mentioned before, and glands, for example, to secrete hormones. Okay, so it's very similar to the somatic, the reflex arc, except it involves the two motor outputs. The two motor outputs result from the presence of two motor neurons. So one motor neuron will be localized in the spinal cord, while the other motor neuron will be localized in a peripheral nervous system, such as sympathetic nervous system, for example. In order, it will relay or convey the signal to another effector or a gland to secrete a specific hormone. So as you can see in the picture here, modified for the autonomic nervous system, there are two motor neurons, one in the central nervous system in the spinal cord and one in the peripheral. Also, you may notice that there was a relay neuron in the somatic reflex arc, while in the autonomic reflex arc, it may or may not be present. The relay neuron may not be present. It can be interact with sensory and the motor directly to transmit the signal to the effector. But in every aspect of the somatic, it is actually very similar to the somatic reflex arc, except for the output and the presence of several motor neurons.